world is seemingly buried under the ideology of the woke. We have so much propaganda being flung around these days, asking us to believe in and do strange things. Many of us aren't comfortable with it. The problem with propaganda is that it's not generally in your best interest to listen to it. Someone is spreading it around, trying to convince you to make life easier on them. Typically, following it only helps them and hurts you. Sometimes they try to convince you to do something risky or dangerous in order to gain a reward. But the reward is short-lived. You don't get to keep it. It's like stealing or committing fraud. Sometimes they convince you to start a conflict by giving you some sort of sense of entitlement or angering you. For example, convincing you to protest for lands your parents didn't actually own, or to migrate away from your birthplace because some other culture supposedly stole it from you. Racism's a great example. They try to convince you to start the fight because your skin color is more important than other people's. Diversity is more important suddenly than wanting to follow laws. Folks spreading propagandas are trying to work around the rights and laws of a region. They're trying to find the loopholes. If they can't do something they want to legally, then they try to convince others to change the laws to make it easier on them. They're trying to rig the game and change the odds in their favor, while handicapping the folks already there protected by those laws. In ancient history and mythology, the folks spreading this around would have been called tricksters. The goal is to remove competition from society. They push others into conflicts so you die, get labeled a criminal, or become a social exile, which basically removes you from the competition. They might be competing for a family inheritance, community employment, business contracts, or wealth opportunities. It might be land or even women. These folks can't compete using the rules. They would be disqualified or they know they won't win. So they basically decide to go around the rules, find another way to win. Today in the Musings of Rin, I'm going to look at a mythological story that's a great example of old Bronze Age propaganda. I actually enjoy reading myths and rediscovering my ancient roots, so I'm going to keep doing that. There's a lot we can learn from the past that's very relevant today, and I'll walk you through this example. The story I've chosen is one of a series of Celtic myths about the Sword of Light. These stories basically follow a general pattern. You get sent out on a quest to find a magic sword, and in doing so you either gain a woman, wealth, or lands. The propaganda being spread here was the promise of wealth for doing something a little bit sketchy. They'll try to claim that the wealth is what makes it worth it. So let's go through it. This story is called The Young King of the Red Waterfall. A young king went to play a game with the Gruagach. Excuse me if I pronounce that wrong. It's basically a sort of wildsman, someone who's outside of the community, living rough in maybe a cave or a hut in the countryside. Notice that I'm telling you what it means. The story didn't. So basically you either had to know what this was, or you're thinking it's just a name. By hiding what the person was, that's part of the propaganda. You lose the understanding of their motives for gambling. But we'll get back to that. Before he went to see this man, he sought advice from a Senegal. Again, a name that they're not telling you what it means. It actually means wise foreigner. This wise foreigner advised him, don't go see the Gruagach, but if you do, ask for a prize if you win the game. Specifically, there's a cropped, rough-skinned maid hiding behind the door. So, right off the bat, we can see our young king was enticed to go see a man. He probably wouldn't have known about this otherwise, to gamble for a woman. The wise foreigner was probably in on the game, because he was standing there marketing for the Gruagach, trying to entice men to go win a prize. So, the young king was curious and went, okay, I'll go play. And he won. They gave him the woman. She turned out to be beautiful, and he married her. He went to play again. His now wife warned him the Gruagach was her father. If he won again, he should only take the dun shaggy filly with the stick saddle. Again, he's being told which prize to take and what's more favorable. So he wins again, and he asks for the prize he was told to take. He was enticed to play a third time, but this time he lost. Now, I don't know how many people are familiar with how con artists work in gambling, but there are certain games where they let you win a couple times to hook you into making a big loss. The Gruagach told him he had two choices. He could lose his head or steal the glaive of light from the king of the oak windows. Presumably this is a landowner with a wooden house. Basically his options were die and let my daughter inherit your wealth, or become a criminal and steal a symbolic sword of light while attacking my enemy for their wealth. Well, it wasn't much of a choice. Naturally, he chose the second option. He didn't want to die. But it does make you wonder why he didn't just say, here, just take your daughter back. This isn't worth it. But I guess that's not how it works. The young king went back to his wife, and she told him, don't worry, you've got the best wife and the second best horse, so you shouldn't be afraid. She saddled the horse herself with a fancy saddle that looked like wood but had gold and silver sparklings. She told him to listen to the horse who would go with him on his journey. Now hold on a second. This horse had a stick saddle before, but now suddenly she's wearing a fancy gold and silver wooden one that she somehow acquired while he was playing the third game with his wife's father. So his wife was spending his wealth on the horse? The now very tricked out horse took him to the castle of the King of Oak Windows. She sent him to the king's chambers while he was eating. Our hero was warned to take the glaive or sword quietly, but he made a sound and the horse told him to flee. They were chased by a swarm of brown horses that they easily outran. Next came a swarm of black horses. One of them was white-faced, with a rider, the king. The horse told him that the white-faced horse was her brother, and he was actually the best horse. He was going to be faster than she was. He has to cut off the king's head in order to escape. She was basically telling him, yeah, I'm not going to help you escape. I commit to not outrunning my brother. So he didn't have much of a choice. He stopped and he defeated the king. His horse insisted on bringing her brother back with them. I don't know about you, but this looks like it was the real reason our young king was sent here, to help free the horse's brother, not so much for the sword. The theft of the sword was probably meant to distract the encampment in order to release the brother. They were probably expecting our young king to die in the conflict, but he survived. He was a better warrior than the King of the Oak Windows. When they got back, our hero's wife told him to bring the sword to her father, but make sure to stab him dead through his mole. So he went and did as he was told. Now either he was following that happy wife, happy life motif, where he just listens to his wife and hopes for the best, or he was really mad at his father-in-law for sending him on that quest, and he wanted revenge too. So he gets back, and his wife is gone. The horses are gone. Probably his wealth was gone too. He didn't know what else to do, so he set out to search for them. They were his promised rewards and his prizes, his wife, his horses, his wealth the horse was wearing. In his travels he met a kusang, or a wild dog, who shared his meal with him. He was disheartened. He wanted to give up the search. It wasn't working out, but the dog's like, I will help you. Keep going. And in the next couple days they met more people for their gang, a falcon and an otter. They all agreed to work together and said he shouldn't give up. So in his quest for justice, he's now picked up some sketchy friends. Great, this won't turn out bad at all. They found his wife and horses in a cave. When she saw him, she wept loudly, saying he had journeyed hard to find her. Now, I don't know about you, but it sounds to me that it's overacting and feigned tears of joy. The horses told her, hey, you gotta hide him. The giant's gonna come back. So she did. It seems like even his wife was following someone's instructions, and she was listening to the horses. The giant returned, and his wife was the only one who would talk to him. She persuaded it that no one else had come. When the giant went to feed the horses, they wouldn't let him near them. The giant said aloud, "Well, if my soul had been in my body, these horses probably would have already killed me." So it's clear that the horses were speaking through the woman. The giant probably wouldn't have listened to them because they were obvious enemies. There was probably some racial prejudices there. The woman, who was ally of the horses, was a better liar, so it made sense for her to do the talking. His wife asked, "Well, where is your soul?" The giant told her it's in the Bonac stone near the edge outside the cave. Now, in these times, you lived your next life through having a child. Your soul was your child. The kid looked like you, it behaved like you, so they thought it was you. The giant was in effect saying, "There's no point killing me, I've already had a child, my life's going to go on." But it is curious, why would he have given up the child's location if it was so important to him? The next day the giant went to leave the cave. His wife pushed the indicated stone so that it was steady on the ledge. She told him she was afraid it was going to be hurt. Since it contained his soul, she'd clean and care for it for him. She was basically offering to nurse his child. It appears like because her friends wanted this giant dead, she was going to make it happen for them. Makes you wonder what the horse people did to earn her loyalty, and why she was so eager to commit crimes in their name. The giant admitted that the stone was actually under the threshold. It had a sheep under it, which held a duck, and the duck held an egg, and that egg held his soul. This implies he already had a bird and a sheep caring for his child. Perhaps, like the horses, these were abstractions for real people. The horses could talk, maybe the bird and sheep could too. He was telling the girl, "I don't need your services," but she did successfully trick him into giving up the real location of the child. Now, our poor king was pretty naive here. He's hiding away in a cave, pretty much along for the ride here. His new wife's friends want the giant dead, and she's going to make it happen. So she got him to help her move the threshold and the stone when the giant was gone. The sheep escaped first, and the king called on his friend the dog to catch it. The duck escaped second, and the king called on his friend the falcon to catch it. The egg rolled into the river, and the king called on his friend the otter to retrieve it. The queen, which would have been his wife, killed the giant by crushing the egg. They stole the giant's gold and silver and visited the otter, falcon, and dog on their way out. Now, the sheep might have been a man, a ram, and it might have been sent to the shepherds, possibly as a slave. The duck, which is the birth mother, was sent to the falcon. The otter didn't get anything, it just got the joy of crushing this child. Not sure why the otter wanted the baby dead. So this gang of peoples basically killed the giant's kid. In these times, you were only allowed one child from the ancient fertility temple, so by killing it, you were ending someone's family line. And you enslaved two people and killed a child. So legend would have you believe that this crazy story was a valiant coming-of-age bridal quest, and that by doing it, you'll end up married, meeting friends, and gaining wealth. But our young king had a kingdom. He had a life before this. He could have earned a wife through honest means and his own wealth. He didn't have to gamble. He didn't have to steal. He didn't have to murder anyone. By interacting with these peoples, he gained quite a rap sheet. 1. Human trafficking. He was gambling for his wife. 2. Theft. He stole the glaive of light. 3. Second-degree murder. He killed a neighboring landowner when that man wanted his sword back. 4. Theft again. He stole a horse, or a slave if it was a person. That horse would have belonged to the Oak King's heir upon his death. 5. first-degree murder. He followed his wife's instructions to kill his father-in-law. 6. Accessory to murder. He followed his wife's instructions to help her kill this giant's child. 7. Human trafficking again. He enslaved 2 other people to his travel buddies to help his wife murder the giant's child. The rap sheet on this one quest story alone is insane. That's probably why I picked it. He would have avoided all of this if he had just not listened to the wise foreigner at the beginning of the story. But they would have you believe that it's okay, right? If he somehow survived death or injury, avoided imprisonment, got away with all these crimes, just because he became wealthy. But, folks, that's not how real life works. They might argue, but the only one who knew about it was his wife and buddies, right? What happens when his wife and buddies, though, don't like him anymore? The story cuts off on their way back home. It doesn't actually say he made it there. It's an interesting point, isn't it? For all we know, after his friends left him, his wife and the horses slit his throat, took the gold and silver, and ran off. Remember, they already tried to run off with the wealth once when he was distracted and sent to deal with his wife's father. The young king was now a wanted criminal. He was seen by a bunch of horses. Let's not forget. If his horse could talk, so could theirs, right? Their horses were brown and black. They were a different race. They weren't going to protect him, were they? All our young king did was win a life of guilt and running from his crimes, just to help out a bunch of wild foreigners. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but the problem in this story was the horses. The female horse was a slave of the gambler, friends with his daughter. Someone had sent our young king to be seduced by that woman to free both her and the female horse. The daughter was spending the young king's money on the horse, not herself. The female horse got her friend's husband to help free her brother. Presumably the gambler had heard of the Sword of Light from her, because they were at the same encampment. The gambler won the female horse perhaps from the King of the Oak Windows, and he really wanted the sword, not her, and she was pressing on that idea. The wife, which is now obviously the lackey of the horse, told our hero to go kill the father. Killing him is satisfying the horse's revenge for being a slave. Perhaps the horse made the daughter also feel like a slave to gain her loyalty. When they got to the giant, the horses were the ones distrustful of him. He offered them kindness and food, even though he knew the horses wanted to kill him. They had racial hate for him, and he was trying to be kind. He did this because they appeared subservient to the woman. He didn't see them as a threat. But because the horses wanted his child's death, the girl set out to make it happen, proving she was the servant of the horses again, not the other way around. And they were all just using their servant's husband into helping them because he, just happened to show up with his buddies. I guess they were just convenient. So if we're not supposed to go on these crazy quests and, for wealth, who are these migrant horse trickster people we're supposed to be careful of then? Well, anthropomorphic creatures exist in many mythologies. A horseman might be a man with a long face, like a horse. Maybe it was someone from a tribe who trades in horses. They're treated like the creatures they live close to. We see long faces across the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Mongolians, Kazakhs, Avars, Turkish, Moroccans, Persians, they all have these features. It's a very widely distributed region, though. We have some clues in the story itself that can help us maybe narrow it down. They say the horsewoman was of dun color, a gray, gold, or tan. They say her brother was black with a white face, so maybe a tattooed white man or a white man who lived like a black man. Maybe a black man with a painted face. There's a tribe in Ethiopia called Karo that paints their bodies white. Perhaps the horsewoman was a half-sister, being of a different color. Maybe she appeared more like a Moroccan, while he was an Ethiopian. Perhaps they came from a tribe of Berbers. Now, oak houses are made of wood. This would have to be in forested regions. So you'd need somewhere that was known for trees, maybe Lebanon or further north in Europe. What about our king's domains? They called him the king of the Red Waterfall. This might have been on a red mountain or a waterfall on the Red Sea near Egypt. There is one place in Saudi Arabia called Mount Uhud that has red stone that floods when it rains. It's famous for its Arabian horses. But wait a second, how did the story get all the way to Celtic Europe, in the British Isles? This is a Scottish fairy tale. Perhaps the story was told closer to home. There's another mountain with characteristic red stripes in Iceland called Hengifoss. Iceland would have had Vikings. If we look at the Viking DNA research, it contains peoples of different cultures. In addition to the Norse and Celts that were present in this region, there were also Kazakhs, Persians, and Mongolians. All of them had that long face and used horses. What about gambling? Gambling and games of chance originated in Asian or Middle Eastern areas. China, India, Mesopotamia. So it's very likely that these trickster folks came from one of the regions that combined horses and gambling. Now, considering where the story was actually told, probably all the way up north in Europe, these Asian-blooded peoples, or Middle Eastern-blooded peoples, would have been migrants. What about the concept of slavery? This seems to be important to the story as well, because that's what started the whole conflict. That's why the horse people, use this man for revenge. The earliest documented case of slave trade was in Mesopotamia, or Ur. It was described on tablets dating back to 3200 BC. The format of these tablets was it described a sales contract. In one example, there lists the name Kushim. It describes a trade of goods between different beers to be delivered to Kushim. If we understand that Asians might be in Mesopotamia gambling or trading here, then this might be a Chinese loanword. Kushim means liquid warehouse. That absolutely does sound like somewhere you would exchange, deliver, or store beers of different types. Perhaps the Mesopotamians were trading with Asians, and that's where they got their gambling from. Now let's look at the slave tablet from Shurupak, just to the north of Uruk. It lists the exchange of two slaves. One is Npap X, and the other is Sukal Gir, on behalf of a person named Gal Sal. Now in Sumeria, they were speaking Aramaic, which is an early form of Hebrew. So if we use Hebrew to translate, Npap X means a female dragon from a spring or fountain. Sukal Gir was listed next to the symbol for a female slave. So Sukal means vizier, Gir means chalk, possibly the vizier's white female slave. There is a story in this region that says Inanna of Uruk had a Sukal named Nin Shubar. She was a companion of Inanna who had helped her on her exploits. When Inanna went to the netherworld, Nin Shubar negotiated her release, pleading with Enlil, Nana, and Enki. In return, Inanna protected Nin Shubar from the Galu demons. She had to find someone to replace her in the land of the dead. So we have evidence of a slave trade of two women in Ur. Did Inanna trade a female dragon to gain the release of Nin Shubar from these Galu demons? So who are these Galu? They were clearly a dominant power of slavers in Sumeria. Well, in the royal burials of Ur, around the source location, there was a golden headdress that features characteristic 3 trees or flowers. The Egyptians had a hieroglyph with the same symbol. It talked of a foreign peoples called Punt or Punet, that they traded gold, red ochre, resins, wood, and animals with. The seal for their peoples contained a depiction of war and peace. In Hebrew, Gal meant spring heap of stones or wave. Sal meant peaceful. Perhaps this is what Gal-Sal meant, war and peace. The Egyptians didn't really acknowledge where the place was explicitly. It wasn't mapped. Some thought it was in Eritrea in Africa, the Greeks thought it was in Somalia, but the headdress implies maybe it was in Sumeria. Egypt's first knowledge of these people came from the time of Khufu in the 4th dynasty around 2500 BC. They were trading in gold. In the 18th dynasty around 1500 BC, Hatshepsut went herself. Her statue looks kind of Asian. She's small build, round-faced, small breasts. They got there by boat, traveling down the Red Sea coast. They called it the Land of the Gods. It was to the east, and had many trading goods only useful for religious purposes: gold, resin, ivory, ebony, animal skins, and cosmetics. It was basically trading in luxuries. In her burial tomb there is a depiction of 5 ships of Egyptian marines being sent to Punt. Part of what they took back was frankincense, ebony, and myrrh. They depicted the Punnites as having red skin and facial features similar to Egyptians. Perhaps they were returning Punt migrants back to the region, not bringing Egyptian marines with them if they all looked the same. Maybe there were many migrants living in Egypt and it was just a normal trip back to Punt and she just went with them in tourism. So it sounds like they became South Asian at this point in Egyptian history, but who were they during the time of the slaving in 3500 BC? Dragons might have been referring to any trader with a boat. In 3200 BC, this would have been pre-dynastic Egypt. The more simplistic Mahdi culture was being replaced in Lower Egypt with Naqada. Naqada was from Upper Egypt, so down south. It implies there was upward migration using the Nile. 3200 BC would have been during the Naqada III period, where we were starting to see the first pharaohs of Egypt. They were merging Upper and Lower Egypt into one culture. Now the pre-dynastic rulers are interesting. We'll start with Iri-Hor. His symbol was that of a bird sitting on a small boat landing on what looked like an island. Other depictions show him landing on a tree, but it basically is the same thing, a bird landing on something. Then it's Ka and Ha. Their symbols appear to be a boat and a bird as well. Ka has the bigger boat and bird, implying larger importance than his partner. Ka had symbols that look like wheat in fields. Ha had symbols that look like an anchor and a boat on water. This implies their people came from the seas, either down the Nile or from the Mediterranean, that they were fishing and farming here. Then we come to the first pharaoh, Narmer. Now, the Narmer palette talks about the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. It gives imagery hinting at what happened here. At the very top, we see 2 rams or peoples with big ears wearing horns, flanking what might have been a fish that was blowing air, being surrounded or caught with an oar or a net. Perhaps a fisherman with a big mouth caused a conflict. Below this, we see a tall man with a large hat standing between 2 very short peoples. The man to his right, which is our left, carries a flower that looks like the Punt symbol. He's got an erect penis and a snake wound around his wrist. A square with a picture of a cave appears over his head. Narmer is the tall man with the hat. He looks like he is standing beside a hammer or an axe. The short woman in front of him is carrying bags over her shoulder. She's got a symbol of a torque bracelet beside her over top of some sort of mound. Perhaps she's a slave or a wife. Maybe she came from that cave over the first man's head. There are several indigenous tribes in Africa, including the Himar, the Himba, the Maasai, and other Pygmy tribes. These cultures collared married women as part of their traditions. They wore hair and skin pigmentations, red ochres, that were sold to Egypt by these Punt peoples. It's possible that these were African indigenous peoples. Now in front of this woman stands 4 children holding what looks like some sort of identification standard on poles. The children decrease in size as they move away from her, implying they're arranged in age from oldest to youngest. The oldest holds a pole which appears to have a large snake on top of it. The next one is harder to make out. It looks like a small four-legged animal with a long tail, sitting on some sort of sled. Maybe it's a cat. The next two are birds. This implies that the dragon man of short stature was more important than the bird men of larger stature, because the short woman queen had his royal kids first. These folks were looking or moving towards the bodies of 10 normal-sized folks who were beheaded, sitting below the boat symbols that looked a lot like Ka and Ha. There was a bird in a field next to a bird on a boat. It looks like they aggressively conquered Lower Egypt from Ka and Ha. Below them we see 2 female lions whose necks are being lengthened into snakes and roped. This implies that cat women were being turned into snakes, possibly through slavery and merging of their bloodlines. Below them, we see a bull trampling a man and a city wall around what looks like a longhouse and some smaller buildings. We do know that Middle Eastern folks today are lighter skinned because they were mixing with Asian and white blood. So perhaps these 2 peoples were the birds and the cats. Maybe the 2 cats who became snakes ended up being Wadjet and Nebket, who were the 2 ladies, guardians of Egypt. Perhaps the dragons were the Punt people, and they were helping Narmer here. Maybe the Ur tablet described a prisoner exchange between their peoples, an Egyptian for a white girl. Did they claim Mesopotamia? Or were they already there? So, if we circle back, were the tricksters of this story, spreaders of our propagandas, Middle Eastern or Asian? Well, it's hard to tell. Their origin appears to be this slaver culture of African dwarves. They appear to have moved outward into Mesopotamia, India, and China. Perhaps Narmer gave the Punt Mesopotamia for helping him win Egypt, or maybe that's where his allies lived. Maybe that's just the region they sent all the slaves to and were farming to create food for them. Now, if you were an Asian or Middle Eastern migrant from a faraway land, you might be practicing the slavery gambling that was allowed where you were from. You might be trying to convince Europeans this isn't a bad thing to, make money off them. If it helps you survive and you're used to it, this is just what you did. You had a history of slaving white folks. This is how you got wealthy and created your empire. It seems like these outsiders were applying that the ends justify the means theory. This was their culture. Let's use this story as a cautionary tale, to be careful of the intentions of outsiders. It doesn't help you to hurt yourself or your neighbors just to enrich the life of someone from faraway lands. Those people may not have the best intentions towards you. They might just see you as an opportunity, someone to hunt. Remember, they kept slaves in collars just like they did their cattle. Our myth of the young king of the red waterfall showed they sacrificed a father, a neighbor, someone's child, someone's wealth, another person's property, or family members were sold into slavery, just to enrich someone else, not yourself. Think twice about gambling and taking on risks. Don't let others convince you to commit crimes. Imagine if you were on the receiving end. If you justified this behavior, you told folks it was okay to do it, then why would they not do it to your peoples? You were okay with it, so it must be okay for them, right? Do you honestly think there won't be angry people calling for your removal and for their justice? I think that's it for today's episode of the Musings of Rin. Until next time.